Me all right?
Yes.
Ian?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome wherever you're joining from to the second of 3 evenings in this series of Thinking Aloud. It's entitled Our Island in Common, a North-South Conversation. And we're delighted to have you with us, and we're looking forward to a really good discussion. My name is Helen McHugh, and I'm a member of the planning group in Belfast South Methodist Church. And you may be aware, this is the first time that we've actually hosted a series with Dún Laoghaire Methodist. And we have very much appreciated the enthusiasm and the insights of our friends in Dún Laoghaire. And we're very grateful, as always, to the Reverend Dr. Johnson McMaster for his leadership and for working with us on this series. Our topic tonight is Reconciling Identities in Ireland, and it will be introduced by Dr. Fergus O'Ferrall. Fergus is a member of Dún Laoghaire Methodist. He's a historian and author, and he was lay leader of the Methodist Church in Ireland from 2016 to 2018. Our format will be the same as usual. After Fergus has spoken, we will break into rooms or virtual rooms for some small group discussion, and then we will come together again for a plenary and a larger discussion at the end. So Fergus, over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you. I'm very honoured to be asked to introduce this discussion. I wanted to start with a mention of a novel by Colin McCann, which was published last year, called A Paragon, an unusual name. I'm not sure if people can see A Paragon, the novel. I recommend It's a brilliant novel, but I just wanted to mention that he has reflected in this with a Palestinian by the name of Bassar Armin, and Bassar's little daughter Abir was murdered by an Israeli soldier, and the story in the novel is about how a Jew and an Arab come together to try, and who both suffered in the conflict, and Bassar finds himself in Bradford studying the Holocaust in the UK, studying the Holocaust, seeking to understand the other, the Jew. And he ruminates, and McCann describes how he ruminates, and I quote, memory, trauma, the rhyme of history and oppression, the generational shifts, the lives poisoned with narrowness. And then Bassan asks, what might it mean to understand the history of another? It struck him early on that people were afraid of the enemy because they were terrified that their lives might get diluted, that they might lose themselves in the tangle of knowing each other. And it seems to me that's a very pertinent reflection as we consider the issues which arise when we discuss how and whether we should pursue reconciling the conflicting identities on the island of Ireland. So I hope in the course of this presentation to pose questions that need discussion and that hopefully the groups can seek answers to. Questions such as raised by Bassan in his ruminations. In our terms, what would it mean for Protestant Unionists to really seek to understand the history of Catholic nationalists? Or alternatively, what would it mean for Catholic nationalists to really seek to understand the history of Protestant Unionists? Because there has been, it seems to me, in both these historic and major contemporary identities on the island, a real failure to seek to understand the histories of the other. And indeed, as Colin McCann notes, a fear that if they did understand the other, that their lives might get diluted, that they might lose themselves in the tangle of knowing each other. I've deliberately put a question mark in my own notes after the title of our dialogue, Reconciling Identities in Ireland, because a key question does arise as to what or who are we seeking to reconcile? And another question would be, is reconciliation even the right pursuit? Or should we be aiming instead simply for greater mutual understanding of our hitherto conflicting identities? And perhaps just seeking greater respect for a diversity of identities. And of course, there are far more diverse identities in Ireland now than simply Catholic or Protestant. And should we be seeking to make that diversity a great richness in a multi-ethnic and multicultural 21st century societies on the island? I wanted just to spend a little time thinking about addressing this fear of the other and this ignorance and fear of the other and seeking to understand the other. Roy Foster, a historian, in a very significant lecture in 1989 on the theme of varieties of Irishness, observed, and I quote, he said then, a new history could show that varieties of Irishness can be complementary rather than competing. At that stage, he rightly noted that historians had underplayed the sectarian conflicts and the confessional identification that was present effectively in history in every walk of Irish life. And he noted how our political aspirations and social thought, both for Catholics and for Protestants, often derive from ethics, theology, and emotion, rather than from standard political or economic philosophies. If that is the case, and I think it is the case, a significant contribution to reconciling diverse identities to a common and shared future would be an honest effort to understand how Catholic and Protestant identities have been forged in continuous sectarian and confessional conflict really since the 16th century. Since Foster's lecture in 1989, the last 30 years or so, historians have contributed greatly to understanding the key factors involving religion throughout the course of Irish and British history. One outstanding example, of course, would be Marion Elliott's When God Took Sides, Religion and Identity in Ireland, Unfinished History, which she published in 2009. Of course, it is true that both Protestants and Catholics have an impoverished view of the other and their past. And we have now some better history, thanks to Marion and other great historians. But what use is better history if it is not taught to Protestants or not taught to Catholics, for that matter? Foster remarked in his lecture in 1989, he said that if the idea that antagonistic attitudes and cultural apartness are sustained by separate schooling, if that's a liberal cliche, he said, it is a liberal cliche because it's true. Integrated education, which currently embraces only, I think, about 7% of school children in Northern Ireland, does raise the issue of the role of churches in sustaining sectarian mindsets. And given that there is such a strong religious basis to the conflicting identities in Ireland, it may appear obvious to us or to many people that the churches have a major role to play in reconciliation. Because, of course, churches as institutions, historically speaking, have fostered sectarian mentalities since the Reformation. But of course, while it might appear obvious, it's not so obvious from the dismal contemporary reality, whereby the churches have remained, as indeed were described today in the service, as captive churches. Now that phrase, captive churches, goes back, I think, as far as I know, to Bishop Hanson in 1973, where he described the Irish churches as captive churches. He said they'd long ago sold their integrity and spiritual and intellectual independence to political ideologies. And that was a deal, he said, that they had made to keep support of their own individual tribes or flocks. Now we know from today, but also we knew that a belated start has been made by the church leaders in their joint statement on the St. Patrick's Day this year, when they sought to set out a vision, and they called this vision a society, they said, where different identities in a pluralistic public square can be valued. And regarding the role of the churches, as was said today, they acknowledged their captivity. They said, we have often been captive churches, not captive to the word of God, but to the idols of state and nation. And of course, this is a tremendously significant and important admission. It is, of course, but a first step towards what's required to addressing the heritage we have of toxic theologies, which have had such violent, destructive consequences. So the churches do need a radical change of mindset and behavior. We would call that in Christian terms repentance. We need to get a new mindset to work together to develop a common ecumenical, contextual, public or political theology that would meet that vision, that public vision of a society now that churches have described on St. Patrick's Day. Of course, it would be, as was said today, and again, the service by our president, based on the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news of love. I bring you good news, he said today. Good news of love, peace, justice, compassion, non-violence, and human flourishing. So I'm suggesting for a discussion and to think about an important question for those of us who are members of churches is to what extent, first of all, are we aware of the past contributions of our churches to maintaining sectarian identities? And then to what extent are we actively supporting a real change of approach by our churches, as now indicated by our church leaders? Because if they don't get strong local and vocal support, inevitably they will remain captive to unreconstructed mindsets in churches. And so even by our silence, we will be complicit in maintaining sectarianism. Of course, we would also be failing in our duties as citizens who happen to be Christians. I now just want to go on and talk a little bit about this conflicting identities of what might be described as Catholic nationalism and Protestant nationalism. We have been divided by different nationalisms on the island, and indeed in these islands. Catholics, of course, say they're proud to be Irish, and Protestants say they're British and proud of it. I want to just draw a little bit from a wonderful book by Benedict Anderson called Imagined Communities, Reflections on Nationalism, on the origin and spread of nationalism. Because nationalism, when you think with Benedict Anderson and other historians of nationalism, they are in fact imagined communities that invent traditions to suit their needs. And very often they have almost a willed ignorance of their own actual histories. Because what they draw on is sort of a mythic, folkloric, or popular consciousness that gives an emotional legitimacy to their identity. Unfortunately, these are often lethal inherited mental constructs for which people are prepared to kill and die, even if they're very limited, in Anderson's terms, limited imaginations. Many become very attached to what are in fact inventions of past imaginations, amounting to a sort of racist patriotism. And in simple terms, Tags out or Brits out slogans serve to make the point, and what that has led to in terms of slaughter of innocent people, left, right, and centre, as we know. So a key question there for us to consider is, how do we now, in 2021 and onwards, offer a richer imaginative vision of how diversity may be a richness for all in constructing together a flourishing and shared future on the island? because if we think it through, there's a philosophical poverty and even incoherence in the constructs of Catholic nationalism or Protestant nationalism. And we need to challenge that with what Johnson and other people might have described as a public theology, and challenge it also with a secular public philosophy on citizenship, which will inspire people to work together for the common good. And you can see the young people today in the service wanting us to talk about climate change and their educational needs and their future. So we need a new contextual theology and a public philosophy that will inspire people to and facilitate them to work together for the common good and to tackle common issues like economic development, housing, health, climate change, education, and tackle them on democratic principles and values such as equality, solidarity, justice, peace, and human dignity. I wanted to say a little bit word about a counterpart lecture on the varieties of Britishness. In a parallel lecture the following year to that of Roy Foster on varieties of Irishness, distinguished historian Keith Robbins gave a very insightful lecture on varieties of Britishness in March 1990. And indeed, he addressed issues of British identities, which have become even more pertinent in the succeeding 30 years. Robbins makes the very important point that Britishness is not a discrete phenomenon that you can sharply differentiate simply from Irishness. Indeed, Britain as a concept or as a term has had, he says, a very troubled history as a term, with a very lengthy but also awkward pedigree, he describes. And given that we now know that English nationalism has come more into view, what Robbins in 1990 noted about Welsh and Scottish identities being then reinserted, and even then pointing to the demise of Britain or the breakup of Britain, you can't sort of use British as a sort of an accepted all-purpose name of a country. Because as he said, Great Britain itself had become problematic and will continue to be so. Of course, we know that historically, there was a British self-image as a Protestant state with a strong anti-Catholic history. And of course, nobody now would see the UK in that way, probably as much, given that Anglicanism has, and indeed Christianity has become so marginalized in what's now the United Kingdom. Britain also had a strong imperial identity. The British Empire was such a force in the world, but that has been liquidated in the last century. So the imperial identity of Britain is now very problematic and a historic relic, although there's a harking back to it. But that identity was probably very attractive to Irish Unionists in the 19th century and in the past, to be part of that great British Empire. Of course, the breakup of Britain has been mooted since the 1970s and so on, but it has actually gathered pace with devolution in the governance of Wales and Scotland. And so much so, of course, that Scottish independence is now a real matter on the agenda, a real prospect in this century or this decade. Robbins was already tracking these developments back in 1990, and he noted very perceptively that the fundamental problem is England and Englishness, leaving the peripheral peoples of the state of the United Kingdom having what he described as a long experience of schizophrenic identity. All the joys and difficulties of a schizophrenic identity, as he said. And he then noted that with these developments in Scotland and Wales, and of course the troubles in Northern Ireland, there would be an English backlash, he said. And he said an English backlash hovers in the background, was his exact words in 1990. Well, we now know with Brexit it no longer just hovers. It has come to the fore. Englishness has revived and indeed has lost interest in Britain as a term. Indeed, the polls reveal they've lost interest in Northern Ireland. If Northern Ireland was to be a limitation on the sovereignty of England in Brexit, English people were content that Northern Ireland would be detached. There has been a backlash in England against immigration. Very often people coming from former British colonies coming to live in England, and that has stirred ugly emotions there. So England has, in many ways, it's engaged now in a process of coming to terms with its colonial past, its loss of global power, relative economic decline, and many people think following Brexit, even faster economic decline. So it's on a journey trying to settle down to become a middle order, multiracial, multicultural society. And the question I want to raise in this context is that arises for Protestants and Unionists in particular, who now claim Britishness as their identity, is what precisely are they claiming? Robbins was, in 1990, was already asking this, because he was asking the question, is Britishness simply a complex of political and civic values becoming detached from any specific anchorage in Christianity? Or what is it? And can Britishness, he was asking then, permit, encourage, tolerate beliefs, values, and practices which are remote from those certainly that would have informed Ulster Protestants? And you can see that working out in the last 30 years with Northern Ireland being forced to follow London norms on a range of issues such as abortion and same-sex marriage and other things that is not attractive for them. So is London the norm for Ulster Britishness? So clarification as to what composes the Ulster British identity and what would be of permanent value to Ulster Protestants, Unionists. What is of permanent value in that identity, which can now be maintained and developed and flourish in radically changing times? That's the question, I think. It's an even deeper question when you probe the Ulster loyalist identity, which colours so much of Unionist political identity. Because popularly speaking, the Ulster Protestant historical imagination is a very simple one historically, which ignores indeed the complexities of the experiences and indeed the very varied aspirations of Protestants in Ulster over the past 4 centuries. Because Northern Protestant popular historical consciousness is focused on upholding the settlement, essentially the settlement of 1689 and 1690. And that was about the principle of Protestant hegemony. Hence, the central place in the mythic history of Ulster Protestant loyalists is the Siege of Derry, 1689. This is the powerful mythic thing of an embattled and enduring people. It's a historical self-vision, one of endless repetition of repelling assaults from the other. And these assaults never seem to end. They never reach absolute finality. They never admit of any fundamental change in their relationships with anybody, with the Ulster, the other inhabitants of Ulster in particular, but with the other provinces of the island, or with those of Scotland, Wales, and England. And as we've seen, all of those things are changing. The Republic has changed, Scotland has changed, Wales has changed, England has changed. So the unchanging nature of the mythic history of Ulster Protestants is, one might say, run out of relationships, because the only relationship it's dependent upon would be a strong Protestant state in London prepared to support them on the contract of their loyalty. And so it's become very problematic for them. And when we're thinking of reconciliation of a shared future, that's a major difficulty of adaptation, which Ulster Unionists in particular are facing, because that mythic history has dominated so much of the politics, not exclusively, but a great deal of it. And it's disabled by this imaginative exclusiveness, as I would describe it. Now, of course, you can say on the Catholic nationalist side, there is some scope for imaginative inclusiveness. If you express it in terms of Irish Republican history or the philosophy of civic republicanism, which would be underpinning a republic, theoretically and emotionally and rhetorically, it's capable of inclusion. Wolfe Tone's idea, common name of Irishmen, in other words, on citizenship in a republic. Of course, we're all aware that in practice and historically and in practice, that inclusive form of republicanism has often been so tragically betrayed, very tragically betrayed and misrepresented. But in principle, what I'm saying is that a goal of a unitary Ireland or a confederal Ireland or consortium, different forms of a new dispensation on the island or between the islands, could involve Northern Protestants in a way which is not true of the current mystic history of Ulster Protestants, because it's about Protestant hegemony. Whereas in theory, republicanism and nationalism could embrace all different identities. That's a matter I think we need to discuss, because such goals and the governance of unity on the island, which might take so many different forms, as I say, in the future. And if unionists are to be key in shaping that future and creating a home place on the island which is secure and one in relationship with the neighbouring island, then they have to address these deep-seated issues. Because the emotionally exclusive quality to Northern Protestant self-vision, of course, is not true of Ulster Protestant history as a whole, which is far richer and more complex than the one that's celebrated annually on ever bigger bonfires or the constant parading of flags and emblems. And that simply reveals a deep insecurity of identity. For example, Irish Presbyterianism, the largest Ulster denomination, has recurrently been marked, and indeed riven often, by contentious disputes, oppositions of class and creed, theological schisms to a remarkable degree. And indeed as well, Protestants have embraced the Enlightenment. And of course, many Protestants were Republicans in the 1790s and in 1798. And even since then, the willingness of many Protestants to challenge established authorities, neither church or state, on issues affecting their liberties, their rights, freedom of conscience, all of that's a very noble heritage. And if this were more popularly understood, it would challenge this single narrative of the dour Ulster Protestantism as a monolithic body, which has always just been understood as a disciplined resistance to a Catholic and an inferior culture threatening their freedom and prosperity down the years, and dependent, as I say, on a Protestant Britain for protection as a minority on the island. The question therefore, and I'm just about to conclude now, the question therefore arises as to how an inclusive politics of the common good and shared democratic governance based on equality for all might emerge while the dominance of an exclusive mythic history holds sway over the mindsets of so many Protestants. As I said, that's not exclusive. If we, in discussion, we can break down the Ulster Protestant identities into different strands, but I'm particularly thinking of the Ulster loyalist one, which is maybe a working class urban phenomenon in Belfast. It wouldn't be necessarily true of liberal middle class unionists and others who would have more cultural aspects to their identity, and maybe liberal ones and civic ones as well. And on that point, I think there would be some room for discussion between civic republicanism and civic unionism, because at bottom, they're both addressing citizenship. And if we could think of multiple citizenships, we would probably be onto a winner, because I'm a European citizen, formerly, and I'm an Irish citizen. Many people can be British, Irish, and European citizens on the island and so on. So multiple citizenships, it would be a way forward, which would give people security in their identities. I just want to finish on a note, a valuable book that some of you will be familiar with, Susan McKay's book, Northern Protestants on Shifting Ground. It illustrates the rich tapestry of Protestant backgrounds and opinions. And as she demolishes the sort of characterization or the demonization of a narrow, intolerant and prejudiced people, because she shows how wonderfully varied Protestant views and people are, and wonderfully gifted. However, unionist politics, with some very good exceptions, continues to reflect the exclusive approach rather than the broader approach. And because it has relied on that mythic history, it has never tackled the social and economic deprivations of the Protestant working class areas and helped them to face up to, and equip them to face up to times of radical change, of deindustrialization and so on, and to find a viable pathway for the union based on, as I say, citizenship and democratic basis and popular consent. She shows, Susan McKay shows in her widely based exchanges with Northern Protestants that she has found a new confidence grow among people from a Protestant background. I'm quoting her here, a new confidence growing among people from a Protestant background who no longer accept the old divisions, the old banishings. Far from wanting to defend and maintain, she said, they want to transform the place. And I could see that in the young people today at the service, their wish to build a better future for everybody, wish to transform the place. They identify with movements that are national, international, and global. And they're not afraid, she said, being labelled Lundies are not staunch, but wish to engage with the issues, such as climate change, are open to shaping their future with others and to making their own history, whatever constitutional changes are agreed democratically. I think that's a hopeful note on which to conclude. Thanks very much.